Russia's ambassador to Britain has said that diplomatic ties between the United Kingdom and Russia were nearly dead after the United Kingdom branded Moscow an acute direct threat. These comments come after Britain last week overhauled its security, defense and foreign policy. Now, this was one of the biggest policy changes since the Cold War era, and it concluded that Russia would continue to pose a full spectrum of threats. The so-called integrated review, crafted over the past year as London recalibrates its post-Brexit foreign policy, also made the surprise announcement to increase the country's nuclear warheads to 260 by the year 2030. Currently, the United Kingdom has about 180 nuclear weapons. Andrei Kelin, who became Russia's ambassador to the United Kingdom in 2019, says that the UK government had repeatedly rejected Russia's offers to, quote, sit down and talk about their differences. Kelin also criticized Britain's decision to bolster its nuclear stockpile, arguing that the reversal of decades of policy was a violation of various international agreements. In response, a British government spokesperson said that modernizing and strengthening the UK's security and nuclear deterrence was a key part of its integrated review, and that its plans do not violate any pacts that Britain is part of. Joining us on this broadcast is WION correspondent Julia Chapman, who's joining us live from Russia. For more on this, Julia, this is a very strong statement coming in from the Russian ambassador, who says that diplomatic ties between Moscow and London are nearly dead. But there have been several key issues of difference between Russia and the UK, isn't it? The killing of former KGB spy, attempted murder of another on British soil, attempts to hack coronavirus research labs in UK, and trying to interfere in UK's 2019 general elections are just some of the charges made against Kremlin.
Yes, that's right. Of course, all of those are strongly denied by the Kremlin, but this really speaks to a vast gulf between the two countries, between Russia and the UK, that has been growing over time. Of course, the worst we saw of it was in 2018 after the attempted killing of former double agent Sergei Skripal on British soil that then resulted in the death of another British citizen. And that resulted in a massive tit-for-tat expulsion of diplomats from Russia and the UK and many other European and Western allies. But now, of course, after this strategic review, Russia has taken offense to that as well, being called an acute threat by the British MOD. And that's why we've been hearing from Ambassador Andrei Kelin over the weekend saying that really there's a diplomatic low point between Russia and the United Kingdom, and saying that ties have been all but destroyed in many spheres, at least in the political sphere, although he did point to some brighter spots in kind of cultural and other areas of cooperation.
Julia, we also, got a very strong reaction from Russia on the news that UK is aiming to boost its nuclear arsenal. Now, UK released its defense policy review, and one of its key aspects is boosting UK's global footprint in the post-Brexit era. Now, UK plans to increase its nuclear arsenal to over 200 from current 180. Russia has criticized this. But can Russia really criticize any other country, because Russia has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world?
That's right. That's what many critics will say, is that they can't possibly be criticizing this move. It's a defensive move, and one of the countries that the UK is trying to defend itself against, according to the MOD, is Russia. But of course, on the other hand, there will be others who say that this possibly gives Russia more of an excuse to develop its own nuclear stockpile, given that it sees other countries that are adversaries in the world are trying to bolster their own nuclear stockpiles. So certainly a lot of criticism coming from Russia on this particular point. But in the UK, the government says that these are necessary moves to make sure that the UK is capable of defending any threat from an adversary.
Very quickly on this, Julia, before we move on to another story, and I need you to stay on that, but very quickly, do we see the ties between Russia and the UK deteriorating even further? Julia, do we expect the ties between the UK and Russia to deteriorate even further after this latest round of confrontations? All right, we'll try and reconnect with Julia, but we've got more information coming in as far as Russia's relations with the United States of America is concerned. Now, Russia's ambassador to the United States arrived in Moscow on Sunday after being recalled for emergency consultations over the worst crisis in relations with the United States in recent years. The envoy was called back after US President Joe Biden last week called Russian President Vladimir Putin a killer. Putin then replied to Biden saying that it takes one to know one. The exchange pushed diplomatic relations between the two countries to a new low. The situation between the two countries were already tense after a US intel report alleged that Russia had meddled in the 2020 US elections. Before takeoff in New York, Russia's envoy to the US had told reporters that he would stay in Moscow as long as necessary and that several meetings have been scheduled. Julia Chapman continues to remain with us. Julia, can we safely say that the diplomatic relations between Russia and Washington also are reaching their lowest point? Now, this is a drastic change under Joe Biden administration from the Donald Trump era, isn't it? Donald Trump tried actively to mend the ties with Russia, but Joe Biden has come in and called Vladimir Putin a quote-unquote, or Joe Biden believed, he agreed that Joe Biden is a quote-unquote killer. Putin replied that it takes one to know one. How do you see the relations evolving between Washington and Kremlin after this?
That's right. It's a stark contrast with the attitude of Joe Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump. Although Donald Trump did have his own issues with Russia over his tenure as president, it's certainly clear that the Biden administration is trying to draw a line and take a tougher stance on Russia when it comes to a range of issues. And one of them, of course, is some of the perceived and alleged wrongdoings of Russia in other parts of the world, not least in the attempted killing of Sergei Skripal, as I mentioned, on British soil. And so when Joe Biden was asked if he thought President Putin was a killer, he replied, "I do." And he didn't really specify as to what he was referring to, but this was certainly marking a very difficult period between the two countries, and it's been met with a very strong reaction here in Russia, recalling the ambassador to the United States, a move that hasn't been used since 1998. Russia didn't even recall its ambassador during the dispute over the annexation of Crimea in 2014, saying that this move was a last resort. So that really stresses how much of a difficult position this now is. Of course, we did hear from President Vladimir Putin towards the end of last week in a response to that, essentially telling America to look itself in the mirror. He didn't accuse Joe Biden himself of anything, but he did say that America needed to recall its own unsavory history, referring to the atomic bomb, referring to slavery and the genocide of the Native Americans. So Russia really saying, well, stop making these accusations, take a look in the mirror yourself.
Right, and Russia has reacted strongly, like you mentioned, Julia, isn't it, recalling the ambassador. But this latest round of confrontation comes after a US intel report suggested that Russia and Kremlin interfered in the 2020 US elections in favor of Donald Trump.
That's right. Of course, Russia denies any interference, and that report was met with a lot of criticism here in the halls of power in Moscow, with many Russian officials saying that was an anti-Russian campaign and that the only interference that's happening is the sanctions that are being used against Russia in response to these allegations of election meddling. Of course, we heard from the U.S. Department of Commerce last week that there would be some new sanctions on Russian industries, and we're expecting to hear some more sanctions down the line. Joe Biden was asked whether or not Putin would be punished, and he said he would pay a price. We just don't know simply what that is, but certainly the American presidential administration is threatening some consequences for Russia.
Julia Chapman, thank you so much for joining us from Moscow with the latest on this story. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.